The Forked Ways. Chapter 14. Sabbath Oak. The wind rose, and Fletch looked up at the night sky. The tops of the pines formed a dark green wreath, into which moonlight poured like water. "It's beautiful," he said. But the field, the cabin, and Betsey Weathers were no longer present, only the clearing in which he stood with red-stained hands. Moonlight led him out of the maze, and Fletch returned to camp. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed in his absence. As he crawled into his sleeping bag, the events of the day circled restlessly through his brain. Though the vision of Betsey and the cabin was dimming, his violent encounter with Cotton Wills was becoming increasingly clear. A day ago, he wouldn't have thought himself capable of such an assault, yet he had acted without the least hesitation. He saw the blade of the sickle come down, saw the bright swirl of blood across the back of the man's hand, the pool of it spreading across the counter. What would Cotton do? Would he call the police? Have him arrested? Fletch thought it unlikely. The man seemed to be moving in the same strange world that Fletch himself now occupied, an enclosed labyrinth which resisted interference from anyone beyond its boundaries. What Fletch couldn't understand was Cotton's reaction. There had been no outrage, no explosion of returned violence. Cotton had become quiet. He had seen something in Fletch that he recognized and respected. Oppositioner. Cotton served the wolf. Fletch was suddenly sure of it. The wolf was real, and Cotton served it. Something was happening in Assembly and in the forest surrounding it, and Fletch was beginning to suspect that it was far bigger than the private battle he was waging with his own inner demons. He had been clinging to the clearing, he realized, and avoiding the swamp. Yet the thought of it was always there in the back of his mind. When threatened, Fletch's tendency had always been to draw inward rather than move outward, to hide rather than to attack. As morning woke in the forest, he determined to take the offensive. It was time he gathered his courage and went out to oppose the oppositioner. He set out for the swamp. It lay in the hollow of a long valley. From a distance it looked benign, the woods along the surrounding hills giving way to grass and low bushes, like a miniature landscape of small forested hills, among which flashed the bright gleams of sunlight on water. Animals had made trails there, along the slopes and ridges of firmer ground, and Fletch kept to these tracks, following them into the opened wetland along the valley floor. Though he remembered Josh Avery's warnings, as well as the strange account of Bill Weathers' night in the swamp, he found it difficult to see how anyone could become lost here. The tree-covered hills were never out of sight, and though the animal trails meandered, they were clear and easy to follow. The only difficulty would be to remember which turn to take when the paths crossed and recrossed each other as they followed the higher ground. Here and there he could even see leaning fence posts, trailing strands of barbed wire, probably marking the boundary of a disused field or pasture. Now and then the brown reeds stirred as an unseen animal, a beaver or a muskrat, stole away at his approach. At one of the points where the trail divided, he found chunks of quartz placed in a diamond-shaped pattern, and in the mud of the path the imprint of a boot. So other people came here at least, leaving markers and footprints as proof that the place had not been completely forgotten. More than an hour passed before he met with anything troubling, and even then it did not take him completely by surprise. A long mass of roots, half buried in the mud, with an oddly human shape. It was one of the green men, as Silver called them. Had he not seen something like it before, it would have been easy to dismiss, a tangle of roots and branches transformed by his imagination into ribs and a spinal column, or at worst the mud-coated skeleton of a deer or wild dog. But the jaw was not a dog's jaw, and the teeth looked human. The green man had no odor. It was not decayed. Rather, it looked as if the opposite were true, as if it were forming rather than decomposing. Fletch did not disturb it, did not even touch it, but he became more cautious about where he placed his feet. He began to notice stones rising at random intervals from the grass and water. They always appeared to the right of the path, regardless of its changes in direction, and after he had passed a dozen or so, he began to suspect that they might have been deliberately placed, perhaps to mark the way. Some were large fieldstones, others looked like shards of granite, and they rose no higher than his waist. Right in, he reminded himself, left out. That should make the direction easy to remember, and a good thing, because he could not actually determine whether the wooded hill far to his left was the one from which he had entered the swamp, or whether it was the hill behind him and to his right, which lay a bit nearer. For some time he had been aware of a group of trees, seemingly within the swamp, but taller than the clumps of saplings which had taken root in the unstable soil of the wetlands. It was difficult to tell whether the area might be an extension of the surrounding slopes, or an isolated island. It was of substantial size, probably several acres at least, and as the path drew nearer he could tell that the ground rose sharply there, rocky and densely overgrown. The path ascended among boulders and jutting ledges of rock until it reached an area of level ground. Ahead, almost completely concealed by a group of stunted oak and chestnut trees, was a structure built of stone. As he approached, he guessed it must be the place in which Bill Weathers had taken shelter on the night he was lost so many years before. He skirted it warily, and found he had reached his destination, a pit of black mud from which tendrils of smoke rose lazily into the air. Fletch had read about such places, and knew that they were found in regions which were geologically unstable. There were several warm springs over near Pine Mountain, but this pit of hot mud was unique, a relic of an ancient fault line which passed through the northeastern part of the state. The building beside it was ancient and in ruins, but by no means abandoned. Glass jugs had been arranged in a row by the wall, and a shovel stood propped by the doorless gap which served as an entrance, along with a plastic 5-gallon bucket half filled with dry mud. Fletch stopped and listened. There was no sound to indicate anyone's presence, but the place had a sense of vigilance about it. Cautiously he peered inside. The small room was arranged as a kind of workshop, with heaps of kudzu vines, coils of baling wire, and stacks of gnarled roots and animal bones. There was no roof, but from a tree limb which served as a makeshift beam, a kerosene lantern was suspended. Though Fletch noticed all these things, his attention was drawn to a blue tarp spread over a stone table in the corner opposite the entrance. Something lay beneath the tarp, and the long humped shape of it frightened him. A cautious lifting of one corner revealed the coarse black hair of some kind of animal. It was motionless, seemingly lifeless, and the reek which filled his nostrils made him certain that the animal was dead. He would have left it undisturbed, except that it was so huge. He tugged back the tarp and stared at the thing in growing disbelief. It was the wolf of his nightmares. The shock of it scarcely had time to register before it became apparent to him that it was not natural. Someone had built this semblance of a creature, fabricated it from rotting hides, formed around a framework of wood and metal. The whole thing appeared to have been soaked in blood, which had crusted and congealed. The work was horrifying in itself, but even worse was the palpable aura of madness out of which it had been born. Fletch backed away, convinced for a moment that this unliving creature was on the verge of awakening. He stood at the entrance to the stone building, eyeing it warily, but could detect nothing of the wolf's own presence. He turned and looked toward the sunken pit, only a few yards distant, where the mud gave off a shimmer of heat. "Where are you?" he demanded. "I'm here, alone. Why don't you show yourself?" There was no reply. His words dissolved into the empty air. The wolf refused to answer, or perhaps was not there at all. Fletch felt a spike of anger. What more could he do? He picked up a long stick and beat his way through the stunted bushes, approaching the very brink of the pit. With a sharp jab, he sank the point of the stick into the solid crust at the edge. Ripples flashed out across the sluggish surface, more resembling a disturbance of the air than of the mud itself. He waited. The wolf did not appear. Fletch sat by the pit for more than an hour. He was exhausted from lack of sleep, hungry and thirsty. Deep in his skull a headache was awakening. Wearily he stood and stretched, turned back toward the stone building. A single set of tracks marked the edge of the mud along the way he had come. They were wolf tracks. Then they were boot tracks. They shifted back and forth in Fletch's vision, refusing to remain either human or animal. Right in. Left out. The path through the swamp trailed out behind him, and he wondered, hardly thinking as he retraced his steps. He reached high ground at last and sank down beneath the trees, too exhausted to do anything but rest. A melody ran through his head, some old folk song from one of his father's records, which he couldn't quite remember, repetitive and annoying. "Jackie boy, master, play me a very well. Hey John, hi John, merry, merry John, among the leaves so green, oh." Fletch drowsed in the shadows of the trees, imagining the words were sung by fiddlers with the heads of animals, deep in a maze of mines. After a while he got to his feet and made his way slowly back to camp. In the tent he opened a package of beef jerky, but it seemed to be all gristle and bone. At last, in late afternoon, he returned to the labyrinth. Even without a blindfold, he threaded the path by instinct more than by sight. There was no sense of leaving solid ground and entering any sort of spirit world, but he must have done something of the kind, because he came upon a narrow wooden bridge crossing a deep ravine, which cut directly across the path. He recognized the curve of the bridge and its picturesque railing immediately. It was the bridge from the Three Billy Goats' Gruff. The bank sloped down to a turbulent stream, and as Fletch got closer, a slim form scrambled from the ravine and swung up onto the bridge. Silver was dressed in jeans and a headband, just the way he remembered him from the first day in the clearing, but there was an ugly stain of blood soaking through his t-shirt. He gave his usual lopsided grin and extended his hand, but Fletch suddenly felt cold inside. He was tired of this. "You aren't Silver," he said. "If you're afraid to show your real face, please impersonate someone else." Silver bowed his head in assent. When Fletch looked up, his features and clothing had altered, and Fletch felt a tremor of recognition. He had changed into the young man from his dream of the room at the bottom of the well, pale-haired and dark-skinned, dressed in a green robe with a belt of leaves. "I'm getting sort of tired of flipping back and forth," Fletch told him. "Which world am I in?" "There's only one world." His voice was like the humming echo of a deep bell. "But there are a lot of places in it." "I know that thing I saw in the swamp was real, but the school bus and Betsey and her garden and everything I'm seeing now, you're all just images, right? Images in my mind, like the dreams I had in the hospital." "All you have ever known were images and dreams," the young man said gently. "But your eyes are opening now. Whatever you can see, here or anywhere, is true, regardless of what other eyes can see." Fletch shook his head. "If that's true, then the world isn't put together the way I always thought it was." "I'm finding that to be the case quite often lately," the young man agreed. You and I are mist in a bottle, dreams of something more real than either of us can imagine. He held out his hand again, and Fletch saw that his palm bore the mark of a wound. Come follow me across the bridge. Welcome to the green pastures. If I had known you were the troll beneath the bridge, Fletch said, I don't think I would have been so scared of the story when I was small. The man's dark eyes narrowed, glittering green. Fletch caught his breath. You, he stammered. You're the wolf. And in shock he realized what must have happened. He had come to the forest to encounter the wolf and had met him 3 times, disguised as his father and Betsey and this young man. No, Fletch, I'm not your wicked old wolf, but I am his kin, and so are you. Advocate and adversary, they're always as close as brothers. Come across and sit down. He led the way to a granite stone beside a thick-trunked tree. Sit here and watch. He lifted away a section of bark, revealing a face which reminded Fletch of the green men he had seen in the swamp. But this face was the face of the wolf, fierce and blind with rage. He lurched to his feet with a cry and saw that it was no longer the wolf's face, but his own, tight with fear and pity. Am I the wolf? Fletch whispered. I saw his tracks where I had walked in the swamp. And Cotton called me the oppositioner. Is that what he meant? Stand on top of the stone, the young man said, and look at the face from above. Warily, Fletch climbed up and looked down. The face was calm and beautiful, with feral eyes and lips that hovered on the edge of quiet laughter. It's you, he said softly, turning from the wooden eyes to the man's strange green ones, so holy and yet so savage. From below, only those below are kindred, the man told him. From face on, only those below and face to face are kindred. From above, all are known as kindred. Kindred. That was the word he had spoken in the dream. The word which had sent a cascade of acorns tumbling from a silver cup. They were all kindred, the wolf and himself and the angelic young man. They were all images of something, or part of a single image. Fletch understood the rage of the wolf and the fear and pity he had seen in his own face, but the young man's laughter and the terrible grace of his eyes still remained beyond his reach. I don't understand who you are, Fletch said, hearing a plea in his voice he hadn't realized he felt. I know the wolf, and I know myself, but who are you? I am John, the Paraclete, John the Beloved, John the King and John the Slave, John the Conqueror. I am the bright brother of your soul, but we are only acorns. You must go deeper and higher. You must find the root and crown of love. The Sabbath Oak? Is that what you mean? The young man nodded. It isn't far, just ahead beyond the clearing. But we're nowhere near, Fletch began, then stopped. Distance and time could scarcely matter here. I'll go then. He left the young man standing on the bridge and went on. He turned a bend in the path and saw that he was nearly at the edge of the clearing. There was a stirring here, an almost audible vibration in the ground and in the air, a deep, unceasing roar like an ocean buried in the earth. It sang beneath the roots and rocks, a strumming of the earth's lowest chord, unhindered since the dawn of time. It made his bones inconsequent. The rocks and hills themselves seemed frail beside this dreadful song of life. This was the voice that had moved as the earth was born, and suddenly he could not bear to go any nearer. It was worse than when the tide rose up around him. The tide could overwhelm him, drown him, drive him into unconsciousness. But this sound could shake the cells of his body into dust, and burn his soul to ash. He couldn't face it. In desperation, he struck out into the brush beside the path. Thorns pierced him as he struggled through, and he quickly realized it was impossible to go far without being torn to shreds. Fortunately, he came upon a steep wall of granite and was able to work his way along it. The ground dropped sharply, and he fell sprawling into a vast drift of decayed leaves. Rock walls rose up on either side. On the ledge above was the bright pattern of a hand, raised in greeting or warning. With increasing fright, Fletch recognized where he was. This was the gap into which Silver had fallen, though in ordinary circumstances it would be far from the maze, in a completely different part of the forest. Panic took hold of him. He clutched at the leaves, and his hand came up against cold, dead flesh. To his horror, he discovered someone was buried here. He dug frantically, uncovering a slim arm. He pulled, heaving the body up through the leaves and into the light, knowing whose it would be. But it wasn't Silver's body at all. It was his own. "This is not happening. This is not." He looked down at the boy's face, ashen and cold, a gaping wound in his throat. Then he looked at his own hands. The dike which held back the tide gave way, allowing it to pour through and rush around him. A black gate opened in his mind, and he looked down, deeper than he thought possible, into a dense, airless world paved with the stones of dread and ornamented with the bleak furnishings of despair. Dimly he remembered Betsey's garden, and heard again the music of her dulcimer from very far away. It sang of forest shadows, of cool wind and summer sky. Above its sound he heard the voice of the Sabbath Oak, merging with the rhythm of the song. It moved in majesty, like thundering surf or a strong wind, reaching down and offering sheltering hands. The tide hesitated and began to withdraw. The pit receded. Fletch sat up and listened. The song held strength beyond all light and dark, beyond all understanding, yet it was intensely present, able to be touched. Leaving his corpse in the leaves, he made his way back to the path. Just within the clearing, he stopped, unable to draw near, shielded from the power of the Sabbath Oak by the smaller trees at the far side. Above them rose a great maze of spreading branches, which filled more than half the sky. He looked up, and within the branches he saw features taking shape. First the face of John the Conqueror, then Betsey's face, then his father's. Last of all he saw Silver's features forming, forever fluid, changing moment by moment, but unmistakable in their identity. For the first time since coming to the forest, he felt completely empty of himself, open and clear. The voice of the Sabbath Oak grew deep and distant, and while he listened, all about him in the quiet forest stirred the breath of summer evening wind. Tarbaby. Cotton Wills lay on the ground, still partially stunned, but alert enough to realize what had happened. Rage at Dwight's rebellion filled him, and rage at the loss of the Nelms girl. She was the final thing he needed. Without her, everything might be ruined. Maybe he could still find her. He tried to reach up and touch his broken jaw, but pain lanced through his arm. His ears rang with a high-pitched drone, and nothing within the scope of his vision remained in focus for more than a few seconds. With a great effort, he managed to shift his body until he could lean against the frame of the barn door. Dwight and the girl were nowhere in sight, but a shape was moving in the grass at the edge of his vision. It reached an overturned wheelbarrow, and a skinny arm rose up, wrapped itself around the rusted spokes of the wheel. Cotton saw a head emerge from the tall grass, and part of a body. It looked like a child covered in mud, dried in places to crusty bluish patches. He had seen human forms vaguely like it in the swamp, but nothing that were this alive, certainly none that could move. Cotton had built things, and he was convinced that he had brought a few of them to life for a while, usually for only a few hours. But the slight human form crawling toward him was no work of his. It must have come to life on its own, among the pits and sloughs of the swamp. Fear iced along his spine, and he looked about for a weapon. The sickle had dropped beside him in the weeds, the point sticking into the ground. Cotton freed it from the earth and held it as best he could in his bandaged hand. If he could get to his feet, perhaps he could make it to his truck before the tarbaby reached him. Tarbaby. That's what it reminded him of. The tarbaby in that kid's book on the magazine rack at the barber shop. Cotton could see it more clearly than he saw his actual surroundings. A metal rack against the wall by the shoe-shine stand. An old copy of Life, with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis mugging for the camera. A woman taking a gaggle of children bird-watching on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Then the Uncle Remus book. Then one of those colored magazines, Ebony or Jet. Cotton came to himself, to find the tarbaby crouched beside him. A girl, her torn dress the same dull color as her matted hair and skin. Eyes fixed and unseeing, only a slight disfigurement for a nose, and a mouth unusually large. She probed her mouth with a gray finger, pulled out something that lived and wriggled. Cotton breathed out a curse and struggled to get to his feet. He veered away from her, bracing himself against the side of the barn as he moved, but the tarbaby caught his boot and stuck fast. Cotton tried to jerk away, but couldn't free himself from her grasp. She began to pull herself higher. In terror, he swung the sickle down and struck her between the throat and shoulder. The blade struck deep, but he lost his grip and fell against the barn, found himself dragged down into the briars. The girl reached up to her neck with long fingers, found the handle of the sickle and worked it free. Black mud dripped from the blade. She held it before her almost quizzically, her mouth stretched open. "Mumblety Peg," she croaked. It was not a game Cotton would have played willingly. The strokes of the sickle fell with an astonishing rapidity, and his body evolved into an intricate pattern of wounds. Shredded clothing and shredded flesh merged in an array of scarlet ribbons. The tarbaby was no longer sluggish in her movements. She fairly flew around him, as graceful as a bird of prey, rending him with her talons. Cotton grasped at the fountains opening in his chest, trying to gather in the blood which he knew was far too precious to waste. The stone building in the swamp was more than a mile away, and his strength was ebbing, the pain immeasurable. Likely he would die long before he reached the altar, but he knew he had to try. The tarbaby could no longer cling to him. She glistened red and slippery in the sunlight, showering drops onto the pine needles, holding the sickle in an upraised hand, in a gesture which was more of a supplication than a threat. Crusts of black mud cracked and sloughed from her skin, slipping down her arms and legs. Cotton saw that she had once been beautiful. Blood clouded his eyes, and he felt scarcely able to stand. With agonizing effort he began to force his failing body through the forest toward the swamp. Among the Friends of God. Betsey Weathers lifted Susanna's hand, helping her over a fallen log. She did not fear pursuit. Dwight was moving away from them, and Cotton's attention was focused elsewhere. There would be time to get Susanna safely to the mill before attending to the matters ahead. Still, Betsey was frightened. Her ability to sense danger to those she loved was beginning to fail. This time, it had come to her almost too late. It would not be long before the diminishment of her vision resulted in tragedy. Had this happened to the others, to those who had, through all the long years, been charged with tasks similar to her own? Betsey had always felt inferior to them, as if she had been numbered in their company by mistake. "Do you know where this path leads, child?" she asked, looking down. "To town," Susanna responded. "It comes out near the bridge." "And where does it go in the other direction, back there in the woods?" Susanna stopped and looked back. Her heart had ceased to race, and she was sure that Betsey would protect her. "To grandmother's house?" she ventured, thinking of the path and Little Red Riding Hood. "That's right," Betsey told her. "But it wasn't your grandmother who lived there, and it wasn't her grandmother either. It was your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, and her name was Susanna, just like yours, Susanna Moon." "Did you know her?" Susanna asked, her curiosity aroused. "No, I did not. She lived in the days of the Indians before I came along. Her house was burned by wicked men, and so were the houses of her neighbors. When they built new ones, they built them over here where we live now, and the old houses in the forest were left behind. If you go back there now, maybe half a mile, you'll find heaps of stones where the chimneys used to stand, and climbing roses, and rows of jonquils in the spring." Betsey drew a small glass bottle from the folds of her clothes. "Take this," she told Susanna. "When you get home, go to the mill pond and draw a cup of water. Then go to your room and put a drop from this bottle into the water. The bottle's nearly empty, but this last drop belongs to you more than anyone else in the world." Susanna took the bottle, looking curiously at the spidery writing on the label. "What does it say?" "It says, 'Susanna singing, Victory Grove, summer 1820. "That was a long time ago." 160 years. "What's in it?" "Just what it says." Susanna clasped Betsey's hand more tightly. "Is everything going to be okay?" "I hope so, child, but I have considerable work to do." "You're like Fletch, aren't you?" Betsey stopped and looked at her. "Why would you say that?" "Because that's the way he is," Susanna replied. "He helps, even when he doesn't know it." Betsey nodded. "Yes, I see what you mean. You're right. He and I are of a kind." "And Silver's like that too, but different. And I'm different." Betsey smiled in amusement. "Everyone in assembly is different. It's to be expected among the friends of God." "I love you, Betsey," Susanna told her, giving the old woman a hug. "Oh, and I love you, child. You haven't any idea how much." Together they reached the end of the path and crossed the street to the mill.